This lesson is about miracles in the Old Testament. So there are definitely miracles in the Old Testament. God shows up again and again in a lot of different contexts, such as the creation of the world, the great flood, victories that God gives us, his people, over their enemies, and then some very specific instances of prophets being aware of and pointing towards God's divine power. Now, in all of these examples of God's miraculous power, it's happening in the world in ways that the people of God can see and touch. But in the story of the Exodus, we have a lot of information about God's miraculous power. In many ways, it's the foundational experience for the identity of Israel as God's people, but also it kind of sets the story of how God works in the world for his people. And the pattern that's established in the book of Exodus happens again and again throughout the Old Testament, and then even into the life of Jesus and what he accomplishes. So let's take a close look at how God does miracles for the Israelite people in the book of Exodus. So one thing that's interesting to me anyway is that the word miracle is not actually used that often in the Bible, at least not as often as it's used outside of the Bible. In the book of Exodus, we see it described as God's deeds of power, or sometimes his wonders. And in fact, it's the same kind of phrase that's used for most of the miracles Jesus performs, and that is deeds of power. In the context of the Egyptian slavery, these deeds of power show both Israel and Egypt what God wants to happen: freedom for slaves. So that's an unusual thing for anyone to want in the ancient world, and especially for the highest power, the divine source of everything, when slavery itself just seems to be the way that the world works. But notice what else happens. The most powerful man in the world is Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Besides wanting something that's really unexpected, God also shows how much more powerful he is than Pharaoh. Maybe we should also notice that God could have accomplished the freedom of the Israelites in a different way. He could have simply magicked all the weapons and money and land out of the Egyptians' possession and into the Israelites' possession. He could have freed the slaves simply by wiping out every Egyptian, but he doesn't. Why? In the book of Exodus, God chooses to show his power through a series of plagues or disasters against the Egyptians in support of the enslaved Israelites. Let's take a look at some of these plagues. The first plague is the Nile River turning into blood. Why is this important? Well, the Nile River was life itself for the ancient Egyptians. Historically, through archaeology, we know that these river civilizations were the only thing that generated the ancient cultures that invented agriculture, writing systems, architecture, and ultimately permanent communal dwellings that became cities. So Egypt as a civilization has been around for thousands of years before the events of the Exodus, and its entire origin and continuation depended on the Nile River. The river would bring water to people and crops, and its cycle of flooding defined every aspect of Egyptian culture and commerce, so that in the end they actually believe that the Nile River is a divine power. So when God acts to block or neutralize the nurturing, life-giving power of the Nile River, it's a demonstration of his power as creator of all rivers and all the earth. The second plague is a proliferation of frogs. So that frogs are everywhere and they can't get rid of them. The Egyptians have this goddess of fertility that they worship, and with the proliferation of frogs, God is communicating that even fertility is within his power. The plague is kind of like this uncontrolled hyperfertility where frogs make more and more frogs until what should be a good thing becomes absolutely terrible and out of control. The second last plague is darkness that covers the land where the Egyptians live, but not where the Israelites live. Of course, it's rather famous that the Egyptians worshipped the sun god, whom they called Ra, as the highest divine power. This control demonstrates that God has power even over Ra, and that it's this God who is speaking on behalf of the Israelites. This God is the ultimate power in the universe. It's important to remember that throughout the 10 plagues that God sends to Egypt, Pharaoh is refusing to recognize the dignity and the rights of the Israelite people. And he's also ignoring a progressive revelation of the power of the God of the Israelites. So God shows that he's more powerful than Ra, the sun god, yet Pharaoh still refuses to release the slaves, and in doing so seems to assume that Pharaoh is a god even more powerful than Ra, besides the God of the Israelites. And plus, the other thing we need to remember is that the whole story of Exodus begins with Pharaoh murdering every Israelite baby boy who was born. There's no question, however, that the last plague, the death of the firstborn of every Egyptian family, and even the Egyptian livestock, is a really terrible thing to happen. The Israelites at the time, and Jewish people ever since, have continued to interpret this as a lamentable event, even though the Egyptians were their enemies. Pretty consistently throughout the tradition, the responsibility for the death of the firstborn is firmly understood to be Pharaoh's. He's the one who refused a reasonable request. He's the one who caused great harm and violence against an innocent people. And he's the one that most obviously ignored the many, many warnings that Moses gave to him to avoid this last plague. So a common misunderstanding about the plagues is that they reveal God as a violent and vengeful God. If that were true, there isn't much difference between him and the other gods of the ancient world. In fact, what is central to what God is saying about himself is that he acts to defend the helpless. In his deeds of power, he gives many clear warnings about a situation which a righteous God can simply not tolerate. He reveals his power slowly with as little disruption as he can, but clearly and for a very important purpose. It's only human refusal to listen that escalates the damage done. From these plagues, as a demonstration of God's power, we have this core idea of who God is, someone who defends the downtrodden and someone who has the power to do so. The God of the Bible has saving power, not destructive power, and it is human pride and violence that collides with and ultimately loses to God's power. The miracles of the Exodus are saving power in that God tells the Israelites how to avoid the power of death through the sacrifice of the Passover lamb. By sparing the Israelites, God is showing them that even with human pride and violence, God can still protect and save those who listen to him and trust in him. This saving power extends through the miraculous crossing of the Red Sea. The power of nature and the power of human violence combine to threaten the entire Israelite nation with destruction. But God, as creator, has the power to reverse their expectations and to protect them from their enemies. The parting of the Red Sea, incidentally, is often understood as the birth of the Israelite nation because it is the beginning of their identity after slavery, and because the natural imagery of passing through waters reminds us of a natural birth. In the desert beyond the Red Sea, the Israelites suffer from lack of water and fruit and protein, and God responds with miraculous provision of water from a rock, bread from heaven in the form of manna, and flocks of quail which show up in the Israelite camp. This is both a continuation of God's saving power, but also a foreshadowing of how God continues to provide and sustain his people by meeting their immediate needs. In summary, there are three important points about the Old Testament miracles in the book of Exodus. First, God acts these powerful deeds as a part of communicating to humans who he is and what he has in mind. Second, in committing these powerful deeds, God is consistent in his behavior as life-giving creator, in that he restores a flourishing life of dignity to his people when human pride and violence would have left them enslaved to a shadow of what human life can and should be. And finally, God does not act once and then disappear. but his miraculous power communicates a faithfulness that continues to journey with his people, providing for their needs both spiritually and physically. What I'd like you to do is to look through a Bible story and tell me that story of a miracle, specifically in the Old Testament. So what is one Old Testament Bible story of a miracle? And from that miracle, I want you to look into, why does God do it? Why does God choose to perform his miraculous power in this way at this moment in the history of his people? And finally, I want you to kind of think underneath and say, if this is why God is doing his miraculous power, what does it say about God? What kind of God is he that he would find this important to accomplish through a miraculous deed of power?